the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
By any measure, the history of the European continent and its people is complex. Over the centuries, various cultures have streamed across Europe's porous borders. For instance, during the Renaissance, the peasants of Italy shared far more with their neighbors in North Africa than they did with their traditional counterparts in England or Germany. The same is true with large segments of Eastern Europe, especially Russia with its significant Asian influences that exist to this day. Beginning to the south and east, Europe is separated from Asia by the narrow channel called Bosphorus, also known as the Istanbul Strait, the boundary between the European part of Turkey and its Asian part to the east. This is where the Byzantine Empire and the Ottoman Turks spread out over modern-day Greece and Turkey. In the far eastern reaches of the continent, Europe is separated from Asia by the Ural Mountains. It is only to the continent's west that we witness a clear geographical border, which is, of course, the Atlantic Ocean. As is the case with every continent on the planet, history began about 4.5 billion years ago. But our brief look at European history will begin with the fall of the Roman Empire. And in many respects, the Roman Empire didn't fall, but rather it was the centralized state ruled by Augustus Caesar and his successors that finally disappeared. But the towns, laws, customs, and the language of the Roman Empire carried on and became the foundation for current-day Europe.
Time is a violent torrent. No sooner is a thing brought to sight than it is swept by and another takes its place. Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius.
During the empire's later years, political and social turmoil was widespread, and the western provinces, encompassing most of Europe, were under constant attack by so-called barbarians. By the 4th century, Rome was a run-down city and much too far from the frontiers to be an effective and sovereign ruler. Emperor Constantine the Great decided to divide the empire between his sons and then moved the capital to Byzantium, later renamed Constantinople. Constantine's most significant act as emperor was his deathbed conversion to Christianity, which empowered the new religion throughout the Roman Empire. Constantine's conversion also enabled the newfound papacy to remain in Rome as it was envisioned by St. Peter, the symbolic first pope. As the Roman Empire's strength rapidly declined, populations from the outside moved in to fill the void. The Visigoths, an East Germanic tribe who famously ransacked Rome in 410, created their new kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula, which is now modern-day Portugal and Spain. In the area known as Roman Britain, known today as the British Isles, the inhabitants invited Anglo-Saxon warriors to their land to help fight off attacks from various tribes. And then the Anglo-Saxons decided to stay. The most successful of the western provinces was Gaul, which now exists as current-day France and Belgium. The Roman Gaulish people integrated with the West Germanic people known as the Franks, whose warriors protected the population against the Visigoths and other invading clans. The Carolingian dynasty was a Frankish noble family, and their rise to power culminated with Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. During his reign in the year 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne Holy Roman Emperor, making his empire the theoretical continuation of the Roman Empire as well as the protector of the Catholic Church. Charlemagne expanded his world by conquest, and his empire incorporated much of Central and Western Europe. Charlemagne's reign also fostered a mass revival of art, religion, and culture throughout the empire. This revival laid the groundwork for a common European identity. The remote area of Eastern Europe was far less populated, but experienced many invasions and migrations during the last 400 years of the first millennium. From their native lands in what is today southern Russia, the Slavic people moved westward and settled in the area now called the Balkans, Poland, as well as Eastern Germany. From the 4th century on, Germanic tribes sailed across the North Sea and invaded what is now Great Britain. These raids by the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes either displaced, absorbed, or destroyed the native Celtic population. In fact, Great Britain was divided into various kingdoms until King Alfred unified much of England in the late 9th century. In 1066, the Norman king known to his contemporaries as William the Bastard, the illegitimate son of Robert the Devil, and later known as William the Conqueror, led his army of Normans to victory over England. The Battle of Hastings was the decisive Norman victory. The Norman conquest proved to be a pivotal event in the country's history as the English language and culture went through a dramatic transformation as it became more closely linked with France and continental Europe, thereby lessening its Scandinavian roots. At the turn of the 12th century, the tyrannical King John ruled England. In 1215, a group of his subjects, led by the barons, forced the king to sign the Magna Carta, also known as the Great Charter of Freedoms. The document asserted certain rights as they pertained to nobles and barons alone, but regardless, the most notable of these was the writ of habeas corpus, which limited unlawful detention. In fact, the Magna Carta has greatly influenced common law as well as many subsequent constitutional documents throughout the world, including Great Britain and the United States. In many ways, the papacy was the most powerful force in medieval Europe, making the Pope the most powerful man throughout the continent. Many popes wanted to expand their sphere of influence and used various political methods to do so. The Crusades, an ongoing military campaign against Islamic expansion in the Holy Land, was one of those methods and cultivated a papal army that executed the will of the Pope. The result was a stirring of intense Christian propaganda that advocated just war against not only Muslims and Jews, but also pagan Slavs and Russians, as well as the political enemies of various popes. Historians and anthropologists have estimated the total number of deaths during the Crusades to be between 1 million and 5 million people. Starting with the fall of the Roman Empire and lasting until the Protestant Reformation, the Middle Ages encompassed nearly 1,000 years of European history. And during these 10 centuries, modern institutions began to emerge. The concept of nation-states with strong central governments stems from the kings consolidating their power during the Middle Ages. These same kings formed courts, armies, and of course began to collect taxes. The concept of limited government also developed, a paradigm that challenged the idea that rulers were all-powerful. The Middle Ages also saw the rise of guilds as a way to control who could or could not work. Early guilds were organized as something between a trade union, a cartel, and a secret society. In fact, in many ways, medieval guilds were the forerunner of the modern-day labor movement, especially when it came to worker protection, collective bargaining, and sickness protection. Many guilds were also the first to develop universities, like the ones in Salamanca, Paris, and Bologna. Early learning at these institutions emphasized teachings of the Bible and the works of Aristotle. European cities emerged as centers for trade and sea travel. The guilder became an almost universal currency as many Europeans revitalized the dormant trade routes with China, India, and the Middle East. Great advances in agriculture were also evolving. Large metal grates pulled by animals plowed the fields. Many European farmers were leaving ground fallow to support the return of nutrients to the soil, beginning the practice of crop rotation. The Middle Ages also saw the rise of feudal society, complete with its reciprocal system of lords granting land in return for military service, courtesy of the vassals. Feudalism was the organizing principle of Europe's rural economy. As the early Middle Ages came to an end, there was a strong resurgence of art. And as the High Middle Ages unfolded, the papal stranglehold on European society began to loosen. Creative consciousness was on the rise. National consciousness also manifested itself as literature evolved and was written in the vernacular of a region rather than traditional Latin. For example, Florentine poet Dante Alighieri embraced his Tuscan dialect and wrote the Divine Comedy. This epic poem about the Christian afterlife criticized the Church and was a sardonic commentary on medieval times. This passage is from the first section entitled Inferno.
I am the way to the Dolan city. I am the way to eternal sorrow. I am the way to a forsaken people. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here.
The times were changing, and the High Middle Ages experienced Europeans returning from the Crusades, where they developed tastes for exotic Eastern goods like spices, silks, fruits, and drugs. This demand further developed trade throughout the Mediterranean, with Venice becoming the most popular of all ports. In fact, Venice was home base for the merchant family well known as the Polos: Father Niccolo, his son Marco, and Uncle Maffeo, as they built a prosperous trading business with the East and China.
The victims ate lunch with their friends and dinner with their ancestors in paradise. Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio.
Bubonic plague ravaged Europe in 1347 as the pandemic claimed more than 25 million lives. The disease, transmitted primarily by rats and fleas, swept across the continent with a vengeance as this so-called Black Death hit individuals suddenly, killing them within 2 days. Many believed the plague was a punishment by God wiping out sinners. Violence broke out against Jews, and mobs were killing those who refused baptism. This brutality paved the way for new religious movements and helped set the stage for the Reformation a century later. The origins of the European Renaissance had its roots in the wake of the bubonic plague, which claimed at least 1/3 of Europe's population between 1346 and 1351. This mountain of death triggered a great revival in art and education. This historic Renaissance began in Italy, where scholars in Florence, Genoa, Naples, and Milan realized that culture was the essence of existence and that education was the foundation for building a new future. It was these Italian scholars, like humanist Francesca Petrarca, that called for a European rebirth. And nowhere was this rebirth more evident than in the arts. Legendary masters such as Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael created their masterpieces as the 16th century unfolded. Da Vinci produced a limited number of paintings, including The Last Supper and Mona Lisa. Michelangelo created the monumental sculpture David, as well as the creation of Adam on the ceiling of the Vatican's Sistine Chapel. And Raphael finished his fresco masterwork entitled The Triumph of Galatea. Other notable artists during the period were sculptor Donatello and painter Sandro Botticelli, whose graceful and individual style helped to define the early Renaissance. Both men were commissioned, and they painted under the patronage of the Medici family, who amassed incredible wealth through banking. In fact, the Medici patronage was so powerful that their legacy exists to this day, as generous patrons of the arts are often referred to as a Medici. Many historians agree that the quintessential architectural work of the High European Renaissance was the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica located within Vatican City. This historic venue holds more than 60,000 people, and the dramatic 16th century renovation combined the talents of Michelangelo, Donato Bramante, Carlo Maderno, and Raphael Sanzio. One of the essential pieces of literature written during this period was the groundbreaking political essay The Prince, written by Florentine philosopher and politician Niccolo Machiavelli. In fact, since the time of its first publication, generations of readers remained fascinated and repulsed by his cynical approach to exercising political power.
So far as he is able, a prince should stick to the path of good, but if necessity arises, he should know how to follow evil. Italian philosopher Niccolo Machiavelli.
The 15th and 16th centuries were a time of growth and great exploration by the nation-states of Europe. A series of sea voyages spearheaded by Spain and Portugal increased European knowledge and their reach across the planet. The explorers and their patrons had numerous motivations for their explorations, but at the core were the prospects for trade and subsequent wealth. Improved naval techniques allowed Europeans to travel further than ever before, reaching West Africa, India, as well as the Americas. The age of exploration achieved long-standing results for European society. It directly led to new technologies, communication, as well as trade routes, and laid the basic groundwork for the first globalization movement. Many of these journeys also had a dark and chilling side, as they were frequently defined by imperial conquest and the death of indigenous peoples. Dominican priest Bartolomé de las Casas details the Spanish-Indian encounter in the West Indies this way.
Of all the infinite universe of humanity, these people are the most guileless, the most devoid of wickedness. Yet into this sheepfold there came Spaniards, who immediately behaved like ravening beasts. Their reason for killing and destroying is their ultimate aim, which is to acquire gold.
The Age of Exploration also allowed Spain to dominate the end of the 16th century, which paved the way for European political and commercial domination over the world until the end of the 19th century. The Protestant Reformation challenged the spiritual authority of the Catholic Church. The movement lasted 130 years, beginning in 1517 with Martin Luther's 95 Theses, which attacked the Roman Catholic Church's policy of selling indulgences, or the sale of God's forgiveness. This written discourse proved to be the catalyst for the Reformation. Martin Luther was a young German monk who first attempted to reform the Catholic Church, challenging various fundamentals, including the Church's belief that salvation can only be achieved through good works. Rather, Luther stressed salvation as a free gift from God, received through one's true faith in Jesus as Savior. As Protestantism spread across Europe, the movement fractured along doctrinal lines. Long-lasting denominations to emerge from the Reformation were the Lutherans, Calvinists, and Presbyterians. In England, the Reformation gave rise to the Anglican Church, which finds middle ground between the Roman Catholics and the Protestants. During the 1600s, the Dutch became the economic leaders in Europe, recognized for building one of the most sophisticated and tolerant societies. The city of Amsterdam was the commercial center led by Europe's leading bank at the time, the Bank of Amsterdam. Dutch society promoted religious tolerance along with the freedom of expression, as evidenced by leading Baroque artists Vermeer, Rubens, and Rembrandt. And finally, the Dutch boasted a constitutional monarchy and a functioning legislature, while most other European nations were still stifled under absolutist regimes. While European monarchs were reluctant to give up power, they also realized their countries could benefit greatly from the spread of the Enlightenment, a cultural movement that promoted the idea that reason was the foundation for authority rather than theocracy and the divine right of kings. Philosopher Immanuel Kant summed up the principles of enlightenment this way:
Enlightenment is man's emergence from a self-incurred immaturity.
The Enlightenment began in France as a result of its well-developed town and city life. Clearly, the large French middle class yearned for new ideas. Ideas that challenged church dogma with the principles of freedom and liberty for common people based on self-governance and individual rights. Catherine the Great of Russia was a prime example of a ruler who altered European society with enlightened reforms. Reforms that included restrictions on torture, promoted religious tolerance, as well as education for girls and women. Religious wars waned in Europe during the Age of Enlightenment, but that was not the case when it came to wars fought for economic and geopolitical reasons. In fact, throughout the 18th century, Europe was a war-torn region. The 7 Years' War involved almost every European power and was fought on various fronts, including Europe, India, and North America, where it's referred to as the French and Indian War. The 7 Years' War claimed the lives of more than 1 million people. At this point, Great Britain was the world's supreme naval power and began their domination of India. During the scientific revolution, Europeans witnessed new discoveries in astronomy, discoveries that generated great controversy as many scientists were forced by church authorities to renounce their new theories. One of the theories not recanted was heliocentric cosmology by Nicholas Copernicus. Although a devout Christian, his theory stated that the Earth revolved around the Sun, challenging ancient Greek philosophers Aristotle and Ptolemy, who had a geocentric or Earth-centered view of the universe. Within a lifetime, Italian physicist, mathematician, and astronomer Galileo Galilei proved the Copernican theory of the universe with his newly invented telescope. And even though the Church forced him to recant his findings, Galileo still spent the remainder of his life under house arrest. Beginning in 1789, the French Revolution marked one of the most important events in French as well as European history. The revolution gave rise to the third class or middle class after centuries of high taxes and ruthless domination by absolute monarchies. In fact, revolution in France was a direct result of the radical changes stirring in Europe based on the Enlightenment principles of inalienable rights. July 14, 1789 marked the flashpoint of the French Revolution, as hundreds of rebellious Parisians stormed the fortress prison in Paris known as the Bastille, a classic symbol of royal tyranny. And the insurgency was essential to the revolution as it signaled the people's rise against absolute power. And then, on October 6, 1789, thousands marched on the Palace of Versailles incensed at the royal family's extravagant lifestyle. They demanded the head of Queen Marie Antoinette as well as King Louis XVI's return to Paris. The Queen was spared, but the protest was successful as the royal family fled back to Paris. But the situation worsened over the next 4 years, ushering in the infamous Reign of Terror, a period of horrific violence that was marked by mass executions aimed at the enemies of the revolution. Executions by guillotine, including the beheading of 37-year-old Marie Antoinette, declared guilty of treason on October 16, 1793.
To punish the oppressors of humanity is clemency. To forgive them is cruelty. French lawyer and politician Maximilien Robespierre, 1794.
Acknowledged for ending disorder in post-revolutionary France, as well as establishing his influential Napoleonic Code, Napoleon Bonaparte will forever be defined as a tyrant who orchestrated massive death and plunder across the European continent. As the French Revolution came to an end, General Bonaparte overthrew France's executive government in a coup d'etat referred to as 18 Brumaire. Shortly thereafter, in 1804, Napoleon declared himself French emperor as his empire took control of vast segments of Europe, defeating Russia, Austria, and Prussia numerous times. But Napoleon was never able to conquer England and was defeated decisively by British Admiral Lord Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar, one of the most crucial naval battles during the Napoleonic Wars. The combined fleet of France and Spain lost 22 ships, while the British Navy did not lose a single vessel. In 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia, but was soundly defeated by the Russian army's Scorched Earth campaign. Bonaparte raised a new army, which was again crushed by the Quadruple Alliance of England, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Napoleon was then exiled to the island of Elba, but he escaped, raised a new army that was again crushed by the Quadruple Alliance at the Battle of Waterloo in Belgium, which finally ended his rule. During his occupation of Europe, Napoleon destroyed various cultures, and as a result of these occupations, nationalistic fervor rose and spread across Europe. In the years following the demise of Napoleon and the subsequent peace treaties of 1815, European countries were beleaguered with social conflicts as various populations sought to assert their rights against autocratic rulers, the result of which was the Age of Revolutions. With the notable exception of Great Britain, whose parliamentary democracy allowed for reform and modernization in a relatively peaceful fashion. As the Industrial Revolution evolved, major transformations in mining, agriculture, manufacturing, and transportation spread throughout Europe, America, and eventually most of the world. In fact, the Industrial Revolution was a key turning point in human history. Machine-based manufacturing forever changed a manual, labor-based economy. Trade expanded significantly with the growth of canals, railroads, and vastly improved roads. Production increased dramatically as water wheels, steam power, and machinery powered by electricity developed throughout the 19th century. But the Industrial Revolution also had an ominous side, as illustrated by incredibly poor working and living conditions for the vast majority of workers. Life expectancy was short, and disease was rampant. And the employment of children at almost invisible wages was commonplace for decades.
The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. German philosopher Karl Marx.
One of the most influential thinkers of the 19th century was German writer Karl Marx. whose rise began with the publication of his work, The Communist Manifesto, in 1848. Along with his 1867 critical analysis of capitalism, Das Kapital, Marx's words would help to spark the winds of change throughout Europe, especially in Russia. As the 20th century dawned, Europe was considerably more stable than in previous decades. The relative calm, coupled with the technological advances of the Industrial Revolution, opened the door for European countries to pursue political power abroad. Simply put, imperialism. By the 19th century, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands had already expanded with overseas colonial adventures. Great Britain, France, and the newly unified Germany began to stretch their political, economic, and military muscle in faraway places. In fact, the telegraph allowed these European nations to monitor their imperial possessions around the world. This imperial aggression also gave birth to the notion of the white man's burden, the idea that the white man had an obligation to forcefully spread their rule and views about civilization on others, usually in lands with valuable natural assets and resources. In his book, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, English naturalist Charles Darwin outlined his theory of evolution and natural selection. This publication proved to be another major challenge to the Catholic Church. Darwin's theory also paved the way for a new group of mental sciences. The most notable was the psychoanalytical school of psychology initiated by Austrian psychiatrist Sigmund Freud. Dr. Freud suggested that humans are not creatures of reason, but that their behavior is motivated by the subconscious. As the Victorian era came to an end, life in Europe changed dramatically as the old ways were quickly being replaced by urbanization, industrialization, and socialism. The middle class embraced a new interest in social reform for the lower classes. Populations were rising as advances in medicine were allowing people to live longer, and many Europeans began emigrating to the United States, South America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And they left for a number of reasons, including anti-Semitic persecution and general overcrowding. Triggered by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria in June of 1914, war erupted across Europe. World War I truly marked the end of war as a glamorous occupation, as new technologies and methods of killing people brought on horrific consequences. The deadliest new product of the war industry was chemical warfare that produced massive body counts. War was now fought by industrial nations mass-producing weapons and drafting armies from entire populations. The advent of the rapid-fire machine gun also took its toll during this bloody four-year war. On May 7, 1915, a German U-boat sank the RMS Lusitania off the coast of Ireland. The ship, owned by Cunard Line, sank in 18 minutes. More than 60% of the people on board died, and the attack dramatically turned world opinion against Germany. And then in April of 1917, the United States entered the hostilities, declaring war on Germany. Opposition to the war was strong as conscientious objectors from many nations refused to fight. In fact, in Great Britain, some 16,000 men requested conscientious objector status, including philosopher Bertrand Russell. With Europe overwhelmed and devastated by war, Russia was rocked with two revolutions that destroyed Tsarist rule and led to the subsequent creation of the Soviet Union. In fact, the Russian revolutions marked the first wave of communism to wash across Europe. The March 1917 revolution forced the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II and was the first demonstrable class struggle as predicted by Karl Marx. The November 1917 revolution was led by Vladimir Lenin, who instituted the dictatorship of the proletariat, adopted the Communist Party, and withdrew Russia from World War I. Lenin also positioned the Soviets as the supreme power in Russia. On September 29, 1918, Allied troops broke through the German fortifications at the Hindenburg Line, marking the beginning of the end to World War I. Less than 2 months later, Kaiser Wilhelm II relinquished his power and the Weimar Republic was founded. And then 2 days later, at 11 o'clock, on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, The war ended as Germany and the Allies ceased hostilities. The total number of casualties, both military and civilian, during World War I was astounding. There were 16 million deaths and 21 million wounded. The war to end all wars left Europe shocked and stunned. The Allied victory marked the end of the German, Russian, Ottoman, and Austro-Hungarian empires. It was against this backdrop that the victorious powers attempted to bring permanent peace to Europe. But the victors were quick to blame Germany for starting the war and vowed punishment, which was drafted in the subsequent Treaty of Versailles that officially ended the war. The treaty forced Germany to take sole responsibility for the war, along with economic and territorial concessions that were harsh, brutal, and punitive, concessions that later would lead directly to the Second World War. As the 1920s unfolded, pacifism and isolation were the prevalent attitudes for the majority of European citizens. The Intergovernmental League of Nations was founded to promote disarmament and prevent war through collective security, and there were some initial successes. But by the 1930s, the League was powerless to halt the aggressive moves by Italy and Germany. And then, as a result of the Great Depression, fringe movements such as fascism became more appealing to the general population, which further weakened the League's lofty goals. By the beginning of the 1930s, Germany was close to civil war as unemployment and poverty wrecked the nation. Alarmed by the rise of anti-governmental parties, the Weimar Republic exploited the emergency powers of the Constitution and ruled undemocratically by executive decree. As a result, President von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany. On the night of February 27, 1933, the burning of the Reichstag, or Parliament building in Berlin, was a key event in the establishment of the Nazi dictatorship and is widely believed to have been manufactured by propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels in order to sway public opinion against Nazi opponents and to assume sweeping emergency powers. On the following day, in a decree enacted for the so-called protection of the people, Adolf Hitler dispensed with all constitutional protections and a centralized totalitarian state was cemented. The policies outlined in Hitler's autobiography, Mein Kampf. Following German troops entering the demilitarized Rhineland in 1936, Hitler embarked on a belligerent policy of expansionism in Europe to establish what he called a Greater Germany. By 1939, Hitler seized Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, making war in Europe inevitable as the appeasement of Hitler seemed doomed to failure.
The broad mass of a nation will more easily fall victim to a big lie than to a small one. German Chancellor Adolf Hitler.
In 1940, Germany invaded Belgium, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, and France. Winston Churchill, now the Prime Minister of Great Britain, was dedicated to the destruction of Hitler and his Nazi regime. Churchill set in motion a new era in warfare by initiating an unprecedented bombing campaign against civilian targets in Germany. Hitler retaliated as the German Luftwaffe carried out sustained bombing campaigns over London and other cities throughout England, cities that suffered heavy civilian losses. This battle, fought entirely in the air, became known as the Battle of Britain. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was a major factor influencing the American entry into the global military conflict. In Europe, the US viewed both Germany and the Soviet Union as geopolitical forces operating adversely to American interests. Washington entered the war to help liberate Europe from Nazi horrors, while at the same time occupying parts of Europe that later would help thwart Soviet domination across the continent. It was the trigger of the Cold War. In 1941, Germany invaded Russia in an attempt to defeat Russian communism and control the flow of oil that was desperately needed to fuel the German war machine. But the invasion failed as another harsh winter hit the Russian front, causing massive death and debilitation to the German army. By mid-1943, the Allies, led by the United States, landed in Italy and were beating back Mussolini's forces. Also in 1943, the largest armed conflict to date took place in the Battle of Kursk on Russia's eastern front. For the first time in the war, a major German offensive was stopped before breakthrough. Russia's Red Army was victorious, but the victory was costly. The Red Army lost more than 235,000 men. From this point forward, the German army went from loss to loss as Hitler began to personally run the day-to-day operations of what had developed into a three-front war. And then, on September 8, 1943, Italy surrendered to the Allies, who had by now unleashed an intense bombing campaign to break the Germans' will to fight. A bombing campaign that destroyed German cities and exacted a huge loss of civilian life. But the campaign had little effect on German industrial production, and it possibly strengthened their will to fight. The war raged on. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy, and this marked the beginning of the end to the war in Europe. 6 months later in Belgium, the Battle of the Bulge proved to be a crushing defeat for German forces. The Luftwaffe was left in shambles, and German casualties were close to 100,000. On April 30th, 1945, the Russian army was storming through Berlin. As Soviet troops approached the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler simultaneously bit a cyanide capsule and shot himself in the mouth. Hitler's body, along with Eva Braun, his mistress he married the day before, were doused with gasoline and set on fire as the Red Army advanced and completed the takeover of the German capital.
Those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. Spanish philosopher George Santayana.
The Holocaust was the systematic, bureaucratic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of approximately 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. The policy, known as the Final Solution, also targeted gypsies, the mentally and physically disabled, Jehovah's Witnesses, and homosexuals. As Holocaust survivor Abel Herzberg has said, "There were not 6 million Jews murdered. There was one murdered 6 million times."
What connects 2,000 years of genocide? Too much power in too few hands. Holocaust survivor and Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal.
After the Allied victory in World War II, Germany was divided into East and West Germany. Post-war economic growth in West Germany, Italy, and France was quite rapid and was known as the economic miracle. Great Britain, devastated by the war, maintained its antiquated factories and experienced very slow growth that resulted in harsh economic times through the 1970s and 80s. After the post-war rise of the Soviet Union, the United States enacted the Marshall Plan, a financial assistance plan designed to rebuild Europe and prevent the rise of communism. The Soviets denounced the plan as imperialistic and enacted their own equivalent plan called the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or COMCON. As the Cold War period matured, Western nations formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was intended to block Soviet aggression by considering an attack against any NATO member as an attack against all NATO members. The Soviet Union responded by forming the Warsaw Pact, another equivalent agreement between Europe's communist states. Well into the 1980s, and with the Soviet Union on the verge of economic collapse, a young and energetic Mikhail Gorbachev came to power and created a policy known as Glasnost, or openness that allowed for criticism of the Soviet system, rehabilitated victims of past Soviet mistakes, and even changed the historical narrative in the nation's textbooks. Gorbachev also created Perestroika, which was an economic restructuring aimed at increased industrial production as well as expanded land ownership. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a complex affair with a number of factors working together. The most significant of these were the skyrocketing costs of the arms race with the United States, as well as the Soviets' Vietnam-like quagmire in Afghanistan. These economic sinkholes, coupled with major societal problems such as massive alcoholism and the lack of consumer goods, brought the superpower to its knees. Since the fall of the Roman Empire, the European continent has been plagued with frequent and devastating wars. So as the 20th century drew to a close, European leaders wanted desperately to secure a lasting peace. Many agreed the best way to achieve this elusive goal was to unite the nations both politically and economically. And from this desire, the European Union was born. There are currently 27 member nations of the European Union, with a citizen population of more than 500 million. The EU's mission supports and promotes peaceful coexistence, prosperity, and freedom for all its citizens. The EU's member states cover a combined geographic area of 1.7 million square miles. And as of today, 15 member states have adopted the euro as the single currency for 317 million consumers. As well, the EU's gross domestic product is now greater than that of the United States. Major policy accomplishments for the EU include the implementation of a clear-cut rule that men and women must receive equal pay for equal work. The EU leads the Kyoto Protocol drive to reduce the air pollution that causes global warming. The EU strongly promotes the abolition of the death penalty among member nations. The EU allows its citizens to travel, live, and work in any EU country, in most cases without border controls or paperwork. The EU remains the world's leading donor of aid for development around the world. And finally, the EU has ensured that there has been no war between its members for the last 60 years. The future is always defined by the past. And based on its remarkable history, Europe's future is destined for continued greatness. And Princess Cruises is proud to be a part of Europe's long and celebrated tradition as we help set the stage for a new chapter on this storied continent. Now you are a part of history.